Ever looked at a fossil and thought, what is that thing? Yeah, so have scientists, for over 50 years. See, when most fossils are dug up, they kind of make sense. Oh, look, a saber-toothed skull, a giant sloth femur, maybe a dinosaur toe. Neat. But every now and then, something crawls out of the earth that doesn't just break the rules. It shreds the manual, eats it, and dissolves into a puddle of evolutionary question marks. And this thing? It's like a rejected Pokémon design made by a sleep-deprived jellyfish. It had no bones, no clear head, a body shaped like melted pasta, and it left scientists fighting over whether it was even alive. This is the story of an ancient creature that doesn't belong in any category. Not animal, not plant, not fungus, just something. A biological middle finger to everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. Let's dig it up. Let's rewind to a quiet patch of Australian rock that, on the surface, looked like the world's most boring geology project. Just some layered sandstone. Nothing exciting. Nothing screaming alien horror fossil. Until they cracked one open. And then, there it was. An impression. Oval-shaped, flattened. No bones, no limbs, no face. Just a weird, squishy ripple, frozen in stone. At first glance, it looked like someone had dropped lasagna on the ocean floor and then fossilized it. This wasn't a dinosaur. This wasn't a trilobite. This wasn't anything. Welcome to the Ediacaran period, roughly 560 million years ago, a time when complex life was just beginning to crawl, or blob, its way across Earth. No mammals, no insects, just the biological equivalent of a fever dream. The creature they found? It would be named Dickinsonia.
And no, that's not short for anything.
It's named after an Australian station manager named Ben Dickinson, who probably didn't realize his name would become synonymous with science's most confusing fossil. When paleontologists first saw Dickinsonia, they thought, okay, maybe it's a jellyfish. Then someone said, no, wait, it's a giant amoeba. Someone else yelled, it's fungus. And a guy in the back said, what if it's not an animal at all? A solid start to your career, when people can't even agree if you're alive. But here's what we do know. Dickinsonia ranged in size from a button to a doormat. Literally. Some were just a few millimeters across, others stretched over 4 feet long. That's taller than some YouTubers. Its body was ribbed, segmented in a way that resembled a flattened, slightly squashed centipede, without legs, or head, or eyes, or any sign of, well, organs. Which led to the first major question. Which way was the front? And the answer was, yes. Because there's no clear front or back. Some specimens looked symmetrical, others had bizarre, lopsided patterns. It was like nature hit randomize every time it made one, and the location didn't help. These fossils were embedded in sandstone slabs that were once shallow seafloors, meaning this wasn't some deep ocean freak. This thing lived in the light, minding its own business on the beach, for millions of years. But here's the kicker. No feeding holes, no mouth, no anus, no digestive tract, no bones, no idea how it even reproduced. So how did it survive? Some thought it absorbed nutrients through its skin, like a giant organic sponge mat. Others suggested it maybe grazed on microbial films, or absorbed sunlight like a plant. Again, the answers were not answers, just theories, and contradictory ones. And while scientists squabbled over it, Dickinsonia did something incredible. It stayed confusing. For decades. The more fossils they found, the less sense it made. No new detail ever helped. Every new angle just added another question. And in a field where even creatures with 4 eyes, spike tails, and body armor can be classified within weeks, Dickinsonia held strong, as a stubborn, identity-free enigma. At one point, one paleontologist admitted it might not even be an animal. Which begs the question, what else could it be? A very patient mushroom? An ancient kitchen sponge? God's failed draft of a yoga mat? And here's the real kicker. Some Dickinsonia fossils were found with a slight halo around them, meaning their outer tissues decayed, leaving behind a faint chemical signature. And when that residue was tested, cholesterol, a fat found in animals, not plants, not fungi, not bacteria. Boom. Mic drop. Dickinsonia was finally an animal. Or was it? Because some argue that cholesterol doesn't mean complex animal, it just means not a rock. And so, even now, Dickinsonia remains technically unclassified. It has no modern relatives, no direct lineage, just a lot of scientific side-eyes and an army of confused graduate students. And remember, this is just the first creature we're talking about. We've got ones coming up that shoot tongues from their guts, have iron-filled organs, and straight up look like alien punctuation marks. So if Dickinsonia confused you, buckle in. So, now that you've met Dickinsonia, the organism that's somehow more mysterious than your uncle's internet search history, let's talk about what it didn't have. Because when you think of an animal, any animal, you expect some kind of structure, right? Bones, a brain, maybe a face. At the very least, a mouth and a butt to get business done. But Dickinsonia said, nah. Let's start with the basics. Skeleton? Nope. That's right, not even cartilage. It didn't evolve a single hard part, which means if this thing had lived on land, it would have been chewed up and forgotten in 5 minutes flat. But because it lived in soft, microbial mats under shallow seas, it left a faint outline on the ocean floor, basically a biological pancake pressed into mud. And if that isn't weird enough for you, guess what else is missing? A brain. Yeah, no central nervous system, no obvious sensory organs, no head. It's basically the biological equivalent of your phone when it freezes. Something's running, but no one's home. And this wasn't a tiny little blob either. Remember, some Dickinsonia fossils measure up to 4 feet long. That's a large creature to be operating without any kind of control center. How did it know where it was going? Did it go anywhere at all? Even movement is up for debate. Some fossils show slight trails behind them, like drag marks. That suggests it moved, probably by pulsing its body against the seafloor. Imagine a soft mattress inching forward like a worm having a slow panic attack. But here's the real kicker. It seems to have done this without muscles. Because guess what else Dickinsonia didn't have? Muscle fibers. Seriously, no contractile tissue. Which means if it did move, it was likely using a form of movement that we don't even fully understand. Some have suggested hydraulic motion, or expansion and contraction of fluid inside its body. So to recap, we have a large, soft-bodied creature that had no skeleton, no nervous system, no muscles, and possibly no real shape consistency. Oh, and no reproductive organs either. Yep, there's no sign of how this thing made more of itself. No eggs, no spores, no seeds, no budding. Which leaves us with the unshakable possibility that Dickinsonia reproduced the same way it did everything else, in a way that makes no sense at all. One theory is that it cloned itself by splitting down the middle, a process called fission, which, honestly, feels right. It would explain the sometimes lopsided body plans, where segments don't quite match. Another idea is that it oozed out larvae or spores, which then settled elsewhere and grew into new Dickinsonias. Yes, plural. That's what we're calling them now. But that still doesn't explain the most frustrating mystery. How did it eat? Because again, no mouth, no gut, no digestive system, nothing to suggest it consumed anything the way animals do. So how did it survive for millions of years? One answer is osmosis. Scientists think Dickinsonia absorbed nutrients through its skin from the microbial mats it lived on, like lying face down on a pizza and absorbing it through your pores. Yes, it's gross. Yes, it's possible. Some scientists believe Dickinsonia was like a cross between a flatworm and a plant, pulling in nutrients through light or photosynthesis, which would put it somewhere between an animal and a piece of lettuce. And that right there is what's so infuriating about Dickinsonia. Every time you try to define it, it slips through the cracks. It looks symmetrical, until it doesn't. It moves, but has no muscles. It eats, but has no mouth. It exists, but we're not sure how. It's like the universe dared evolution to make the weirdest creature possible, then deleted the blueprint just to mess with us. And yet, despite all of this biological chaos, Dickinsonia was successful. It shows up in multiple Ediacaran fossil sites, spread across what's now Russia, Australia, Ukraine, and Canada. For a creature with no brain and no bones, it was everywhere. So maybe that's the lesson here. If you ever feel lost, confused, or like you don't quite fit in, just remember, there was once a brainless, boneless doormat that became the dominant life form on Earth. And it didn't even need a spine to do it. In science, there's a comforting illusion that everything can be named, sorted, and stuffed neatly into a box. Mammals here, reptiles there, arthropods over in the corner doing whatever unholy thing arthropods do. But then, Dickinsonia showed up. And it basically told every scientist on Earth, good luck. See, classifying life is supposed to be straightforward. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. A nice little hierarchy that helps us feel like we understand the chaos of biology. But Dickinsonia? It didn't check any of the boxes. It was the kid in class who refuses to follow the rubric and still somehow passes. Let's back up. When the first Dickinsonia fossils were discovered, scientists had no clue what to do with them. This wasn't like finding a dinosaur tooth and saying, "Yup, that's a carnivore." No. This was like finding a wet sock that had been fossilized for 560 million years and trying to figure out which department to send it to. So naturally, the scientific world did what it does best in moments of confusion. It argued. Some paleontologists tried to throw Dickinsonia into the animal pile. Others thought it belonged with fungi. Some bold souls even suggested it was a giant single-celled organism. Yes, single-celled, even though it was 4 feet long. Which begs the question, if Dickinsonia was single-celled, does that make it the laziest animal in history? Or the most efficient? The confusion got so bad that Dickinsonia became what scientists call a problematic fossil. That's a real term. It means we have no idea what this is and it's ruining our day. At one point, someone tried to shoehorn it into the Venda Bionta, a made-up kingdom just for weird prehistoric blobs. That's how weird this thing is. It made scientists invent a whole new taxonomic category just to get it out of the way. But even that didn't stick, because as more specimens were found, the contradictions only multiplied. For example, it looked bilaterally symmetrical, which is a big deal in evolution. That means it had a left side and a right side, like most animals today. Cool, right? Well, turns out that symmetry was just an illusion. A closer look revealed that the left and right segments didn't line up perfectly. They were offset, like someone had installed its body panels during an earthquake. So now it's not truly symmetrical, but it's also not truly asymmetrical either. It's just annoying. And then came the movement trails, those drag marks we mentioned earlier. At first, these seemed like proof that Dickinsonia was a mobile, active animal, until they found specimens that looked like they had split into two, or just duplicated, which meant Dickinsonia might have reproduced as it moved, like an evolutionary Roomba that left copies of itself behind. No mouth, no brain, possibly immortal, and capable of spawning clones just by crawling. If this isn't the origin story for a horror movie villain, I don't know what is. So eventually, researchers turned to chemistry. In 2018, a breakthrough came when scientists performed lipid analysis on a well-preserved fossil, and they found traces of cholesterol, a molecule only found in animals. Victory, right? Wrong. Because then came the pushback. Wait, said other scientists. What if the cholesterol didn't belong to Dickinsonia? What if it came from the microbial mats it lived on? So, once again, the creature was left in taxonomic limbo, too animal to be anything else, but too weird to fit in. And that's the thing. Dickinsonia defies classification, because it might be from a time before classification made sense. It's a relic from the biological Wild West, when nature was just throwing stuff at the wall to see what stuck. Some experts now believe Dickinsonia could represent a stem group to animals, basically a very distant cousin to the rest of us. Not quite part of the family, but close enough to crash Thanksgiving dinner. But even that's a guess. Because ultimately, when it comes to Dickinsonia, science hasn't reached a conclusion. It's reached a stalemate, and that might be its greatest achievement. It forced us to admit, we don't know. In a world of labels, categories, and Latin names, Dickinsonia is the biological shrug emoji, and somehow that's perfect. So, here's the part where things get even weirder. Because after decades of digging, scanning, and arguing about Dickinsonia's anatomy, origin, and taxonomic standing, one uncomfortable question still lingers in the background. Was it even alive? And no, that's not a joke. See, when you look at a fossilized creature, whether it's a dinosaur, a trilobite, or some other prehistoric abomination, you're usually dealing with something that was very clearly alive. It ate, it grew, it maybe got stepped on by a bigger version of itself. Case closed. But with Dickinsonia, you're not even guaranteed that basic assurance. Let's unpack that nightmare. The reason for this existential identity crisis is that Dickinsonia doesn't behave like anything we currently define as life. It lacks organs, it lacks a nervous system, it lacks sensory input. It doesn't show clear evidence of feeding, pooping, or reproducing. It's essentially a biological flat circle that appeared one day, multiplied without explanation, then disappeared like a bad experimental software update. And here's the kicker. This isn't just a "we haven't figured it out yet" situation. It's a "maybe our definition of life isn't wide enough" problem. Some researchers have suggested that Dickinsonia may have occupied a transitional state, something between non-living chemical processes and full-blown metabolizing life. In other words, a soft-bodied mystery that might have straddled the line between biology and geology. And this isn't unheard of in the early Earth timeline. Because remember, Dickinsonia lived during the Ediacaran period, a time that makes Jurassic Park look like modern history. Back then, evolution was in sandbox mode. No rules, no standards, just vibes. Life was still figuring out what worked and what was wildly impractical. So is it possible that Dickinsonia wasn't a failed organism, but rather an early prototype for what life could become? Think of it like a cosmic beta test, a buggy version of multicellular life. Alive, sort of. Functional, kind of. Logical, not even close. And yet, it persisted. Fossils of Dickinsonia have been found in multiple locations across the globe, meaning it wasn't a one-off anomaly. This thing dominated shallow seafloors for millions of years. That's not the track record of a mistake. Which brings us to one of the more mind-bending theories. What if Dickinsonia didn't have to eat, move, or reproduce the way we think of it? Because it was plugged into an entirely different kind of ecosystem. Imagine a biosphere that didn't rely on predator-prey relationships, digestive systems, or mobile appendages. A slow, oozy soup of chemically interactive mats, where living simply meant existing long enough to replicate through osmosis or chemical diffusion. And that's where Dickinsonia fit in. It didn't chase food. It didn't run from danger. It didn't do much of anything. It just was. A passive slab of life that gently absorbed its environment, maybe exchanged molecules, maybe didn't. And for whatever reason, that worked. Some even speculate it could have had a symbiotic relationship with microbial films, either feeding on them, living with them, or being built by them. Now we're not even sure it was one organism. It might have been a colony, like corals or slime molds. Or, get this, it might have been part of a mat, indistinguishable from its surroundings, camouflaged not by intention, but by structure. Which means every time we look at a Dickinsonia fossil, we might be looking at a fragment of something bigger, something less individual, more system. Let that sink in. A creature without a nervous system, without eyes, without muscles, without anything resembling a body plan, might have still been alive. Not in the sense we understand it, but in the way the early Earth allowed it. Not because it was advanced, but because everything else was too primitive to compete. So yes, Dickinsonia might have been alive. Or not, or sort of, or it might have been a placeholder for the word alive until something better came along. Either way, it worked. It thrived. It fossilized. And now, millions of years later, it's haunting paleontologists across the globe like a silent, gooey riddle. Because that's the thing about the earliest life on Earth. Sometimes, it doesn't make sense. Sometimes, it doesn't play by the rules. And sometimes, it makes you question if alive even means anything at all. So after all the confusion, controversy, chemical testing, and decades of academic bickering, what did Dickinsonia actually leave behind? Well, not much. No skeleton, no evolutionary descendants, no museum diorama with an animatronic model wiggling creepily at passing school kids. But somehow, its absence might be the most important thing it ever gave us. Let's rewind for a second. Most fossils, especially the big ones, get remembered because they helped lead to something. Like how early tetrapods crawled out of the water and said, "Yeah, land looks awful. Let's live here anyway." Or how feathered dinosaurs eventually gave us birds, and then, much later, bird memes. But Dickinsonia didn't lead to anything. It just was. It didn't evolve into anything we recognize. It didn't leave behind a family tree. No second cousins, no distant relatives. No spin-offs, reboots, or evolutionary sequels. In fact, the more we study it, the more we think Dickinsonia might be an evolutionary dead end. A long, quiet experiment in multicellular weirdness that, after millions of years of quiet success, just kind of vanished. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because Dickinsonia challenges this idea we love to tell ourselves, that evolution is a straight line, that every organism is just one rung in a great ladder, climbing up to complexity, intelligence, and eventually, us. But Dickinsonia reminds us, nature doesn't build ladders. It builds webs, tangled, branching, overlapping webs full of paths that go nowhere. For every species that becomes something great, there are 100 that just stop. Some die off, some get eaten, some quietly fade out without ever breaking a rule, committing a crime, or doing anything wrong. Dickinsonia thrived for millions of years. It was widespread, abundant, and successful in its time. And then Earth changed. Maybe the environment shifted. Maybe new organisms outcompeted it. Maybe it just reached the natural end of its biological script. Whatever happened, Dickinsonia disappeared. And for a long time, no one even knew it existed. Until one day, a fossilized squish mark in a slab of sandstone whispered back, "I was here. Figure it out." And that's exactly what we've been trying to do ever since. But here's the beautiful part. Even in its stubborn refusal to fit into any box, Dickinsonia has already changed the game. It helped push back the timeline of complex life by tens of millions of years. It forced scientists to reconsider what counts as an animal. It even challenged the way we define life itself. Because when you're looking at a creature that has no bones, no brain, no mouth, no gut, no symmetry, no lineage, and no clear function, but it still shows up everywhere in the fossil record, you start to question everything. And maybe that's the real legacy of Dickinsonia. Not that it led to humans, not that it survived longer than most, but that it stood as proof that life doesn't need to make sense to succeed. That confusion, ambiguity, and messiness are built into the origin story of biology. That sometimes being a featureless, blobby mystery is enough. And millions of years later, that same featureless blob is now fueling arguments in labs, rewriting textbooks, and forcing paleontologists to say the three words they hate the most: we don't know. So next time you see a fossil that looks too weird to be real, too simple to be complex, too ancient to matter, remember Dickinsonia. It didn't roar, it didn't bite, it didn't have cool armor plates or dagger teeth. It just existed, perfectly, mysteriously. And then, it left, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence we haven't finished reading yet.